Hello there. This is an impromptu stream continuing with the furniture item, adding poses to the furniture item for IMVU. So we were working on the adding poses to a furniture item, and this is just a continuation of that with an animated pose, which is not that different to a static pose. But as I was about to start working on this, I thought I might as well stream it. So this is just a stream of working on the pose rather than necessarily it being anything instructional, although that may come at a later point. So what we've done is created a couple of new animated poses that are quite tricky to do with this skeleton because the bones point all over the place, and they point all over the place because of IMVU using 3D Studio Max, the skeleton for which has a different bone orientation to just about everything else. So the skeleton orientation in Max differs to the world orientation. So in Blender, we have to point the bones all over the place. So that makes animating quite tricky, but it is possible. Just takes a bit of patience because you're having to manipulate individual bones as opposed to a string or chain of bones that would otherwise be possible. So, what have we done? We created a couple of poses. There's two versions of the same pose, just to show how they won't play back terribly well when streaming, because the streaming process uses up CPU power, which slows down the process of Blender rendering each of the frames. But just shortening the animation by 10 frames changes its behavior, or the appearance of its behavior. So that's something to look out for when animating your poses, that the duration, how long they are, changes the outward appearance of the sequence and makes it look more natural. This assumes your frame rate is set to 30 frames a second to match IMVU. So, just continuing with the current pose that was being worked on before the stream, which is a running behind the avatar pose that needs to be adjusted. So I don't know how much conversation there will be in this particular stream because one has to focus on posing the bones. So that's a copy paste. So you select the bone, position it using the copy paste icons. The up arrow is copy, the down arrow is paste. So you can manipulate a bone, copy its position, and then transfer it to another keyframe. So that's handy. An auto insert is available, and it's active in this particular instance, and you have to go to the timeline for that. So timeline editor, the one with the clock face, and then the properties So that's this section. The red button turns it on. The keys at the type of information that's being selected, what sort of data is being inputted, and then the specific type of data in terms of whether it's location, rotation, scale, and a number of other options. And this is only available or accessible from the timeline for some reason. So if that's active, you can just pose the bones and it'll automatically insert them. Dope sheet action editor. And it's just a question of going back and forth between the keyframes, that's these little markers, and making adjustments to bone positions so what is this, 35, that's set to 34, so let's try playing that through. Yeah, so that goes wonky. So what we're trying to do this is a cycling animation, or one that repeats. So what we're trying to do is make the left side and right side similar to one another, so the animation loops without any obvious glitches or hiccups. So that essentially is flipping or inverting the pose at this keyframe, at frame 15, so that that's similar to the one that's at frame 1 and 35. So we need that leg outstretched, which is that leg. Whoops, wrong leg. And they don't have to be exact. They just have to be approximate, because you don't necessarily want, when you're creating a cycling animation, an animation that repeats, you don't necessarily want it to be exactly the same left to right, right to left as the legs swap, because that can look too robotic. So you have to watch out for that. So copy those, select all, copy, paste. So that moves a little bit too quick, so let's grab that, move that to 40 and insert, not there. Whoops. So what you don't want to do as well is because the thigh doesn't necessarily stretch, the whole leg is swinging instead of what generally happens is you tend to fling the lower leg backwards and then the rest of the leg catches up. Not quite like that. Because it's not staying on the ground long enough, or near the ground. Whoops, wrong bone. That's a little better, but the swing is a bit aggressive. I have to fiddle with that. Need to lower the character closer to the ground so we get the bob. Let's try that. 40s. Yeah, not happy with that front, well, the leg that's facing us. Not happy with that. Let's try that. I wonder actually if no, that won't work. Hmm. Whoops. I think I'm going to have to get rid of the end frame and then redo those. Oh no, not for those. So that's that one. Let's just clear. So this is Alt R. That just clears the rotation of the Alt R, Alt G. That clears rotation and location data for poses. So get rid of that lot. This is where an articulated skeleton with inverse kinematics comes in handy. Because what we should be able to use although this is the male avatar, what we should be able to use is a skeleton that's articulated with inverse kinematics, which basically makes animating much easier because we can select an individual bone, and depending on where you or how you position that, you'll get a more natural articulation. So, for example, with the running pose, the problem that's occurring here is the natural alignment of these bones relative to what the pose is doing at the extension of the leg being kicked back at the termination or the return point of the run cycle. And getting that position properly relative to the previous pose is tricky when you have to manipulate individual bones, because doing it that way, manipulating individual bones, you don't always get a natural articulation of the armature, which is where inverse kinematics come in handy, because they, oops, this is a bit slow because of the processing, but they allow you to manipulate the armature and produce natural, because everything's linked together, natural orientations of the bones relative to the pose that you're trying to create. Now, if you're using 3D Studio Max for IMVU poses, that's a doddle, because the skeleton allows you to do that. But as mentioned at the beginning, because we're using Blender, we can't use this skeleton, which is how it would be set up in Blender if you were actually doing animated characters or animated poses or anything to do with animation actually. If everything was set up within IMVU more universally, instead of it being Max specific, we would be able to use these types of skeletons and armatures, but we can't. We have to use these, where the bones point all over the place, which breaks the natural articulation of the skeleton. So if this is given an inverse kinematic, it's that one, and we'll just create, it's a simple kinematic, so you're essentially creating a bone chain. So we've got, well, you probably can't see it on screen, but there's a relationship line, faint. There's a relationship line running from each of the bones. I'm not quite sure which one. So it'll be running from there to there, and then there up to the thigh bone. But we've got a relationship line that shows a connection between the bones. But with that kinematic in place, pressing the articulation button doesn't always produce expected articulation, because the chain is reliant on the orientation of the bones, which means it starts to deform in a very odd way. So you can add it, but it doesn't necessarily produce the kind of pose that you want, because the the articulation essentially runs along the length of the bone. So what it's doing, so these are our bones, and the articulation is generally going to run along the length of it. So that's X, Y, and then yeah, so it's X, Y. So it's running along the length of the bone. But when you change the bone's orientation, the articulation of the IK is still trying to operate in this orientation with the bone pointing this way, but we need it to work this way. So we're trying to get the bone to articulate against its well, we're trying to articulate the bone the way that we would expect it to, which is going against its physical orientation, which makes the end result just very difficult to work with. And that's all to do with IMVU being set up to use 3D Studio Max rather than any sort of generic format. Although we can export to FBX, the FBX that IMVU uses is actually set up and specifically caters to 3D Studio Max, which makes makes this kind of thing very difficult to do, or time consuming, very fiddly, tricky to do. This is the clothing avatar, by the way, so you can get that from catsbits.com/IMVU. IMVU. Just put that in chat. And this really is one of the reasons why there aren't many animated actions produced by Blender users. It's not because Blender can't produce animations. It can. It's because this problem with the orientation of the skeleton means that it's very difficult to actually produce a reasonably functioning animated avatar. So it's just a question of just slowly adjusting the bones to get the it's too much of a height jump there. Oh, that's a little bit better. Ah, poop. Down. Got so many poses. I'm going to have to get rid of all of these. Clear all of that. And do it again. So we've got a height raise. So that's 24. Let's go 25. So that's 9. Right, so Should be able to just, let's try it this way. Right, so what we want is this leg to replicate the one on the other side, and then we can and then we want the other leg to look like this one. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. Right, there we go. That's the problem with essentially recycling. So let me just save this. Recycling poses or animations. It's a good idea to reuse things just to save you time, but in doing so you can cause issues. So we want to end on, so that pose is the end, that's our target. Oh, there we go, that seems to have worked. Uh, 31. So this section that's being used right now frame range, this is where you can set the start and end frame of your animation, but also for cycling animations you can set a specific end frame. So we've got 31, but what we don't want, we've got 31. There are actually 30 frames because with Blender we start on frame 1, not frame 0. So this is our frame range. But this frame and this frame are duplicates, so you don't actually need to play this end one. So what you can do there is in your end frame, you set that to the frame, whoops, yeah, 31, so that's frame 30. And what that'll do is it'll loop sequence and play frame 1 only. Otherwise you can, depending on the sequence, you can create a little hiccup because the same pose is present at those 2 frames, which basically means it creates the visual impression of a short pause, which when cycled through looks like a hiccup. And once you've exported it to IMVU, you compensate for that. But in Blender, what you would do is you set your frame range so that you are 1 frame less than the actual length of the sequence. So this is 31, so you set your end frame at 30 and it'll loop. Needs a bit more work, but yeah. So with the first and the last frame, we want to get the body positioned more or less to replicate the middle pose. So we need to do a few adjustments to the lower half. It's only really the legs that that need to be matched up. The upper half, as long as the first and last frame of the upper half of the body are matched, so there's a neat cycling through the animation, you can add a bit more randomization to the upper half, because when that plays relative to the legs, so you could have the legs as exact duplicates of one another, so when it cycles through, you don't notice any errors. But the problem with that is it looks robotic. So what you can do with that is you can compensate by making things like the arms, the shoulders, and the upper body, make those a little more random and not matched in the same way the legs are. So that disparity between the two, between the upper half and the lower half, results in a sort of a visual. It compensates visually for the cyclical nature of the sequence. So it'll just keep going, but because the upper half is untidy and the lower half is tidy, the two of them together create the visual appearance that the animation is not quite as uniform as it might appear to be. Whoops, wrong leg. There we go. So copy those into the end frame. And the hip. Is it that one? Yeah. So the first and middle might be able to reduce that by a frame. So adjust the end frame 29. Let's play that through. Still needs a little tweaking, but that's about right. So the next bit is to adjust the shoulders. Oh, and what you can also do, forgot to mention this yesterday when we were doing the stream. If you've got a static pose and you're using an animated pose in conjunction with it, when you're animating using the static pose, because your animation tends to be longer than your static pose, it can be tricky in the later frame ranges to sync up your animated pose to the static one, because obviously the static pose has reset itself. So all you need to do in those instances is just select the keyframes. So this is Alt right click to select a row. It selects a row of keyframes, and then you can do Shift Alt, right click another row of frames, and just move them. So that's a G key and just expand them outwards until you give yourself enough room so that the pose remains in place whilst you do your animation. And it doesn't matter if on export, because you can with a static pose, it doesn't matter how long this thing is, because you can set the frame range, so you only really need frames 1 and 2. But the fact that it is 30 or 50 or 100 or however many frames long in Blender doesn't matter. So what we need to do now is adjust the arms. It's yeah, X-ray is disabled. Right, so oops, wrong bone. So this is the hand bone, not the wrist. This is the wrist bone, and that controls the twist of the wrist, which can make the arm look a bit funny. So we kind of want to keep the position, the approximate position of where the hands are. I don't know how visible that is with the, let me X-ray. So the hands, generally speaking, you want to keep them in the same rough location on the back of the avatar. And then manipulate the skeleton to match that the hand positions. Which might be, if we're lucky, as simple as just doing that. Just adjusting the shoulder bone. So copy those, paste. It's never that easy though. So yeah. Yeah, that's about right. Doesn't need to be perfect. Although you can do that and spend a lot of time Looks like a massage. So that is another animated pose. So they are possible, but it takes a bit more effort with Blender because of the skeleton setup. So let's save that. Just save over. So we've now got bumper 13 and bumper 11. But we need to accommodate that in the furniture item. So we need to add, in the same way that we did before with the seat pose, we need to add another couple of standing nodes. Well, depending on how many animated poses you want, which then means that the furniture item is going to be totally overloaded with pose spots. I'll switch to a different theme to make this easier to see. There we go. So this item is going to have an absolute ton of pose spots. Because what we're going to do now is just duplicate the standing nodes, or the nodes that would be associated with the standing avatar. So that's the handle, seat node, and the catch room picture. And because they're already parented to the root node, we don't need to worry about that. So just duplicate, select them all, and then Shift D. That duplicates. Just right click to reset them. Just move them to one side because we want access to the handle node, which we can reposition above the other handle node to make that easily selectable. And rename them, so that's handle 12. That's seat 12. And again, although it's the standing node, or was the standing node, it has to be unique and associated with a custom pose. And then we've got our catcher and picture. Those are 12. Whoops. And then just move those back place. Save this. And then export. FBX selected. Apply modifiers, leave that. Armatures, disable that. We can leave those. You can either disable them, deselect, or just leave them because nothing's exported that's to do with animations for that. Export. And then in IMVU, create. New rooms and furniture, furniture. Right, so that's the default furniture item. Import the FBX, so load FBX. Find the file that we just exported, which was 6. 0, 0.01. Import. And we should now, yep. So now we've got all the seat nodes, and then the ones in the middle, these are our, well, they will be the animated standing poses. So all we have to do now is export that file, save over that. Right, so for this, to export this, it's best to export the entire contents of the scene. So export FBX, deselect selected objects. We don't need these. We don't need armatures. Always disable add leaf bones. But we do need the animation stuff, but we need to disable NLA strips and force end, start end keying, disable that. What this does, as per previous videos, this forces Blender to export the sequences that it finds as individual strips, animations, and then just export. And it'll take its time. Right. And then we should be able to import this. So FBX import again. This is number 11. And as there are, as discussed yesterday, as there are two armatures, two avatar armatures, one is a duplicate, which is our reference object. The process is picking up the fact that there are two armatures, but we want the one that is 86 bones without the numerical append 0.001 in this instance. So we want that one, 86 bones, okay. is going to bring in a lot of stuff that we don't need. So we don't need the meshes, deselect. We don't need the textures, so deselect. And there we have our, whoops, just deselect those two, they were unused. So these are our, this bottom section, these are our static, and then this upper section, these are our animated poses. So all we want are the animations. So we clear the mesh and texture information because we don't need those. Make sure your apply scale is the same, 0.01, and then just import. Success. Apply changes. And because we've brought in a skeleton, that skeleton has been set as the default for the furniture item, so we've lost all our handle nodes. So go back into config. Make sure you select the furniture skeleton to get back the nodes. Alright, let's just set up and then actions. So add, say what, stance.dodgem 12 or 13. Let's try 13. Avatar, same ensemble, and then we've got our XAF, the converted files. And what's 13? Loops infinitely, and then, so how many frames was this? 30. So we should be able to do 1 to 29. Replace the sign. So when we click on this, dagnabbit, was it 13 or 12? Uh-oh. There we go. Oh, 12. So we've got 12 seat nodes or avatar spots with 13 animations. Confusticus. So 13, so that's 12. Okay, so that should work. There we go. There is our animated pose. That looks quite funny actually. Add an actor. Add just one pose. Stance.jam 02 avatar. Infinite loops, and again 1, 2, only need 4 frames. Well, I don't even need 4, you can actually put 2 because it's a static. You only need at least 1 frame and that's it. Place. So for the actor, which spot is that? There we go. So it's one of those spots. And then, oh, hands are a bit high. Leave the hair alone. Might have to make some adjustments to that, but that is basically an animated avatar. So you might have to do things like that. Once you've got your pose in, and checking to see where everything appears and then making adjustments. That looks like it's the spine. It's ignored the spine settings for some reason because the hands have stayed in the same place So one of the spine poses, yes, so one of the poses for the spine bones has gone out of sync. So it's just a matter of going back into the pose and editing the, updating the sequence. That's funny. Just rinse and repeat. Save this just for reference. Save as. And this is .jum version 7. Right, so we'll call it quits there. That's an hour and 20 odd. And in the next stream we'll just follow up with any corrections and changes and just discuss some of those. But that is how you create an animated avatar pose. It's actually not that different from creating a static pose. So you're creating a sequence. You're basically creating a sequence that uses essentially multiple static poses along a timeline, which automatically morph between themselves in order to create motion. And it's just the hard part of it is just that it's fiddly to do, and that's it. Time consuming and fiddly. Right, on that note then, we shall call it quits until the next stream. So, thanks for watching, lurkers. Lurkers lurk as lurkers do. And we shall see you anon. Bye for now.